Long before anyone remembered when the first castle stone was laid, or which king's banner first flew over the valley, there was a mountain that people only pointed to from a distance. In the quiet hours of evening, when shepherds gathered their flocks and the village lamps began to glow, the mountain's peak blushed the color of old blood in the sunset. Children whispered that it was because of the vampire king who lived there, and their elders did not correct them. They only drew their cloaks a little tighter, glanced once at the crimson peak, and closed their doors before darkness settled. The stories that wandered down from the mountain were very old and had been retold so many times that no one knew which parts were true. Some said the vampire king drank the blood of armies and turned battlefields into deserts of bone. Others muttered that he could command shadows to strangle a man's courage in his own chest. But there was one detail that never changed in the telling, no matter who spoke or in which season. The vampire king was alone. No lovers, no companions, no court of monsters. Only a silent castle on the mountain and its master, watching the world grow and forget him, then remember him again in fearful songs meant to keep children from wandering too far at night. On a night like any other, when the moon hung low and pale over the mountain, the vampire king stood at the highest window of his castle and listened to the music of a village feast far below. He could not see the faces of the people, but he could hear the faint chiming of laughter, the thin melody of a flute, the rise and fall of many voices sharing warmth. He did not remember when that sound had begun to ache inside him rather than amuse him. Centuries earlier, he might have smiled at the smallness of their joys, the frailty of their bodies, the way they clung to one another as if love could outlast the grave. But as the years gathered like dust on his unchanging hands, something inside him shifted, like a door dragged on forgotten hinges. He put his fingers to the glass. There was no breath to fog it. His reflection looked back at him, as ageless and pale and remote as the moon itself. His black eyes, once as bright as polished obsidian, were slower now, like coals that had burned too long. "Again," he murmured to himself, "you are listening again." His own voice startled him. In the quiet of his eternity, he rarely spoke aloud. The sound bounced off the stone walls and came back thinner, as if afraid to stay. He turned away from the window and paced the long gallery, his trailing cloak whispering over ancient carpets. Portraits lined the walls, kings and queens and warriors from human realms that no longer existed. He had watched their kingdoms rise and fall, had walked battlefields after their wars, feeding with a cold, distant satisfaction that belonged more to a force of nature than to a man. Once, long ago, he had believed he was exactly that, a force. Hunger wrapped in a form shaped like a human, sharpened by dark magic, set loose upon the world by powers that liked to amuse themselves with curses. He did not remember his human name. He did not remember the last time he had been gentle with anything living. But the music from below tugged at those blank spaces, as if memories long buried were trying to float to the surface. He could have shut the windows, sealed the castle tighter, walled himself away from the sound of life, as he had done 1,000 times before. Instead, he walked to the old throne room, where the ceiling was painted with constellations no stargazer remembered how to name. He sat on the throne as he had sat for centuries, straight-backed, hands resting lightly on the arms, the gesture of a king who expected to be obeyed. There was no one left to disobey him. No servants, no courtiers, no subjects. The magic that had made him what he was made solitude cling to him like a second cloak. No living creature crossed his threshold unless it was called by him or driven by desperation. Tonight, neither was true. The tall doors of the throne room were not entirely closed. Somewhere below, a smaller door had not been latched. A wind, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and roasted grain, slipped through the cracks and wound its way up the silent stairs, into the dark corridor, past the empty halls. And into that winding air, like a leaf carried by a hidden current, stepped a girl. She had followed the sound of an old, cracked bell. No one in the village knew that the castle still had a working bell. They thought its tower was just another jagged silhouette along the mountain's crown. But earlier that evening, as the villagers had gathered to celebrate the harvest under a string of lanterns, the girl, her name was Mira, had heard, far above the music and laughter, a single slow toll rolling down through the sky. It did not sound like a summons or a warning. It sounded like a sigh. Mira was not like the other villagers. While they busied themselves with trade and weather and marriage prospects, she preferred questions that had no immediate answers. She had always felt a peculiar pull toward the mountain, as if it were a person watching her, rather than a heap of stone. The older folk had scolded her for staring at it too long. "Don't invite its notice," they would say. "Respect the distance." Mira respected fear, but she did not always obey it. When she heard the bell that night, she quietly set aside her cup, stepped away from the circle of firelight, and walked toward the dark line of trees that marked the edge of the village. By the time anyone noticed she was gone, she was already following a narrow, forgotten path up the mountainside. The moon made a pale road for her feet, and the wind seemed to guide her, nudging her this way and that around loose stones and sudden drops. The air grew colder with each careful step, but the bell did not sound again. Its single note hung in her memory like a question. What kind of king, she wondered, rang his own bell? Inside the throne room, the vampire king felt her from the moment she stepped onto the first stair. He did not see her with his eyes or hear her with his ears. Rather, he felt the soft, stubborn beat of her heart, picking its way closer, refusing to be daunted by the castle's vast silence. "Turn back," he murmured, though he did not send the words down to her. "This is no place for you." His hunger stirred at her presence, out of habit more than need. He had fed rarely in recent decades, drawing what he required from wilderness beasts and storms. He had found ways to sip energy from moonlight, from old runes carved into the castle stone, from the slow decay of forgotten spells. It was not satisfying, but it was enough to keep his body anchored to the earth. Yet with the girl's approach, that old reflex awoke in him, the knowledge that a single person's blood could quiet every ache. He could turn her back with a thought. He could cloud her mind and send her stumbling home, none the wiser. He had done so many times before, when travelers lost their way or thieves sought to plunder his high, lonely halls. This time, he did not. He did not yet understand why. Mira pushed open the great doors with both arms. They groaned on their hinges but yielded. Cold air spilled out, smelling faintly of stone and something older, like the inside of a chest that had been locked for generations. She stepped into the throne room with the careful respect of someone entering a temple. Her boots, worn soft by fields and hillsides, made almost no sound on the black marble floor. Her eyes, accustomed to the softer darkness of forests, widened as she took in the tall columns, the distant ceiling scattered with painted stars, and at the far end, seated on a throne of midnight stone veined with red, the figure who watched her approach. He looked nothing like the childish drawings the village children scratched in the dirt when they dared each other to speak of the vampire king. There were no dripping fangs, no monstrous wings, no fire in his gaze. He looked like a man carved from a single piece of pale moonstone, his hair falling dark and straight over his shoulders, his features too still to be living, too attentive to be dead. His eyes, when they met hers, were deep and lightless, like wells that had forgotten how to reflect the sky. "You heard my bell," he said. Mira did not startle at the sound of his voice. It had the calm weight of something that had rolled down many centuries. She lowered her head in a small bow, unsure of the proper way to greet a king no one had seen in 100 lifetimes. "I thought I did," she answered. "If it was yours, then yes, my lord." He considered her, taking in the homespun wool of her cloak, the faint stain of berry juice on her fingers from the feast, the way her shoulders were held neither too low nor too high. She was afraid. He could sense the quickness of her pulse. But the fear was braided with curiosity and something more difficult to name. "Why did you come?" he asked. Mira looked up at him carefully. She had many answers and none, all at once. How could she explain the way the sound had entered her chest and sat there like a stone until she began walking? How could she tell him that all her life she had felt there was an unfinished sentence hanging over the world? And tonight, from that single toll of his bell, she had heard the beginning of its ending. "Because you rang," she said simply, "and because no one should ring a bell if they do not want it heard." A faint crease appeared between his brows. "You are the first to come. In all these years, you are the first to answer it." "Maybe the others were better at being afraid," she said, and the corner of her mouth tried to smile, though it did not quite succeed. The Vampire King's hunger slid along the edges of his awareness, testing him. He could end this conversation with a single step, a single touch. The warmth in her cheeks, the soft thrum of life within her, these things called to the oldest part of him, the part that remembered nothing but thirst. But something else was stirring now. Something that had been quieter than even his hunger for so long that he had mistaken it for emptiness. Loneliness. Not the proud solitude he had worn like armor, the kind that allowed him to look down on the entangled lives of mortals from a height. This was a smaller, more shapeless ache, like a child that had sat alone in a dark room for so long it had forgotten its own name. "Do you know what I am?" he asked. Mira lifted her eyes fully to his, meeting his gaze that had scoured battlefields and watched stars collapse. Her village had 100 tales about the creature on the mountain. None of them had prepared her for the sickle-shaped sadness she saw in his features. "I know what they call you," she replied. "They say you are the Vampire King. They say you feed on whoever wanders too close and that your shadow can swallow the sun." He waited for her to step back, to fumble for a charm around her neck or a scrap of a prayer. She did not. "And what do you say?" he pressed. Mira thought of the bell, of the single, lonely note that had fallen from the mountain like a tear no one else had seen. "I say that anyone who rings a bell so softly cannot only be a monster," she said. The words were simple, but they struck him like a hand placed gently over an old wound. He had worn others' hatred like a cloak, accepting it, even welcoming it. It was easier to be feared than to consider what he had become by fear's hand. He shifted on the throne, a subtle movement, but the air in the room responded as if a great tree had bent toward a smaller sapling. "I am dangerous," he told her. "More dangerous than your stories know how to say. My curse is not only in what I drink, but in what I am. I was made to be what you fear." "Then why warn me?" Mira asked, taking a cautious step forward. "If danger was all you are, you would have let it happen already." He did not answer at once. Long habit made him want to deny her words, to claim an inhuman simplicity, hunger, power, and endless night. But the bell had not rung itself. His hand had pulled the rope. His fingers had felt the vibration travel through stone and sky. He had called. Not for prey, not for a victim. For a witness. "I am tired," he confessed, and the word echoed up into the painted stars. "Tired in a way that sleep cannot touch. The centuries have grown heavy. The nights have grown long. I no longer remember what it is to be anything but this, and I do not know how to end it." Mira listened. Her fear settled somehow, made smaller by the enormity of his weariness. She thought of her grandfather, whose hands had once been strong enough to lift her high and spin her laughing in the yard, now barely able to thread a needle. He, too, had spoken of tiredness that did not leave, of a body that had lived past its natural season. "What do you want to end?" she asked softly. "Your life or your loneliness?" The Vampire King looked at her, and in his eyes there flickered, for the first time in more years than he could count, something like surprise. No one had ever stood before him and asked what he wanted, as if he were not an inevitability but a being with desires and regrets. They are not separate, he said. My solitude is part of the curse. I do not age. I do not change. I do not belong among the living. Whenever I have drawn closer, it ends in destruction. In me emptying them, or them coming with sharpened stakes and bright prayers, hoping to empty me. Did you always want to be this? Mira asked. He almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat, unused to the shape. The memory that rose was not clear, more like a torn fragment of cloth than a whole tapestry. He saw a young man, himself perhaps, with hands calloused from honest work, eyes lit by some ordinary joy, a brother's jest, a lover's smile, a field well tended. No, he said quietly. Once I wanted a life like yours, small perhaps, finite, filled with faces that grew old beside mine. I did not understand when they offered me this what it would cost. Mira's brows drew together. They. He lifted one shoulder, the motion eloquent and tired. There were those who whispered of power without end, of a night in which no fear could touch me, of strength that would make death itself step aside. I was young then, too proud of my own fearlessness. I thought if I could not die, nothing could ever be taken from me. And instead, Mira said slowly, everything was taken and only you were left. The words settled between them like falling dust. Outside, the wind moved along the mountain, rattling a loose shutter, stirring the dry grass at the cliff's edge. Inside, the vampire king looked away, his long fingers tightening on the arms of the throne. You see now, he said. I summoned you and you came. The fault is mine. I have spent so long being the terror in your stories that I did not know how to ask for anything else. Mira stepped closer. Her heart beat faster, the sound of bright drumming in the quiet room. She could see now that his cloak was not pure black, but woven through with faint, shifting patterns, as if shadows themselves had been sewn into the cloth. What would you ask, she said gently, if you believed you had the right? He did not answer for a long time. His gaze traveled past her, to the doors she had come through, to the hallways beyond, to the whole wide world that lay below his mountain, full of fires and feasts and children who grew up and grew old and told stories about the monster above them. At last he spoke. I would ask, he said, to stop, not only my own hunger but the fear I cast. I would ask to return what was taken, not my life, for that is gone, but my place among lives, the wound I am in the world. Mira thought of the path up the mountain, so narrow and perilous that no one used it anymore. She thought of the way her villagers avoided looking up, as if the sky above that peak were less theirs than the rest. She thought of the lonely bell. If you could give all this up, she asked, would you? He looked at her sharply. You do not understand. It is not so simple. I am bound to the dark magic that made me. If I lay this body down by force, the curse will not die. It will fly free, looking for another host. Perhaps dozens. Perhaps it will break into 100 hungry pieces. Better one monster on a mountain than a scattered plague. Then what is there to do? She whispered. What indeed? He had asked himself that question at the end of many nights. Gazing out at sunrises he dared not feel on his own skin. He had scoured old books, bargains, and bloodlines. He had considered letting himself be sealed in stone, in ice, in the ocean's depths. But every answer left the curse waiting, crouched like a predator in a cage, ready to spring when the lock rusted. Perhaps there is nothing, he said. Perhaps eternity is the price of the mistake I made when I was too foolish to know the weight of forever. Mira's eyes filled, unexpectedly, with tears. She thought of all the times she herself had made small, sharp choices out of anger or pride, only to regret them later. What if one of those choices had been able to stretch through centuries? What if a single reckless heartbeat could chain her to her worst moment for the rest of existence? It cannot be right, she said quietly, for a single mistake to keep giving pain forever. Not to you, not to the world. What would you have instead? He asked, a bitter gentleness in his tone. Mercy, from what? There is no God here to forgive me. only the night and the consequence of my own hand." Mira wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, annoyed at herself for crying in front of an ancient king. Yet the tears cleared something in her, like rain washing dust from a window. "Where does your curse live?" she asked. "In your body, in your blood, or in your choice, the one you made when you first said yes to it?" He frowned slightly. "In all of these, in none, it is bound to my being." "But your choice," she pressed softly. "That choice, surely, does not have to be the last thing you ever decide." He opened his mouth, then closed it. The idea was almost too simple, like a door that had always been there, disguised as part of the wall. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I am saying," Mira replied, "that if the curse was able to enter you when you chose it, perhaps it can be weakened, or even released, if you choose something stronger, even if that choice costs you everything you have now." He looked at her with something like pity. "Child, I have lived through empires collapsing, stars falling from the sky. There is nothing stronger than the magic that made me." "There is," she said, her voice very small but very sure. "There is sacrifice." The word sat between them, ordinary and vast. He almost told her that sacrifice was a mortal's virtue, a comfort given to those whose lives ended quickly, to make their endings feel like more than loss. What could sacrifice mean to someone who could not die, whose choices had no finish line? Yet his mind, stubborn and restless beneath centuries of frost, began turning over her thought. If the curse had come when he chose himself above all others, his survival, his power, his fear of being small and forgotten, what would happen if he made a choice that put himself last? "What would that look like?" he asked, and there was something like hunger in the words, but not the old hunger. A new one, a thirst for an ending that was also a gift. Mira took a breath. She had not come with a plan. She had followed a bell. Yet standing before him, she felt as if their meeting had been waiting at the top of her life like a hill she had always been meant to climb. "You said if you die by force, the curse will fly free," she said. "But what if you don't die fighting it? What if you offer yourself to something else entirely? Not out of fear, not out of hunger, but out of love for the world you have hurt." He watched her, the old, dark magic in him listening in spite of itself. "How," he asked softly, "does an exile show love for the world that exiled him?" "By stepping aside," she said. "Not into darkness, but into giving. If your being holds this curse, then perhaps your being, your will, can send it somewhere it cannot feed. Somewhere empty of fear. If you could let go of your hold on yourself completely, not because you want escape, but because you want healing for what your existence has wounded, maybe the curse would have nowhere to land." He shook his head, but less in denial than in awe of the courage of her suggestion. "You are asking me to dissolve myself." "I am asking whether you would," she corrected gently. Silence fell, deep and ringing. The stones of the castle seemed to lean in. He imagined it, letting go, not as a fleeing from discomfort, but as a last, great act of giving. Gathering up all the strands of the curse that ran through him, all the dark threads that had bound his nights, and pulling them in, tighter and tighter, until there was nothing left of him but the knot, and then untying it. To do so, he would have to relinquish every name he had worn, every throne he had sat on in shadow. He would have to set down not only his hunger and his power, but his loneliness, too, his constant, grim companion. He would have to trust that the world could hold itself together without a monster like him to resist, to define itself against. He would, in some final sense, have to forgive himself enough to believe that his last act could be a gift, rather than just an apology. He looked at Mira, this young girl from a forgotten village, with berry-stained fingers and eyes that refused to look away. "Would you stay?" he asked. "If I try this, would you stand witness, so the world knows this was done and why?" She swallowed. She was afraid again, but the fear was part of something brighter. "I will stay," she said, not as a guard, as a friend. The word snagged on something deep inside him, pulling it loose. He rose from the throne with a slow grace. As he stood, the shadows in the room shivered, uncertain. His cloak settled around him like nightfall. He descended the steps until he stood before her, taller by a head, colder than the stone beneath their feet. "Then listen well, Mira of the village," he said. "And remember, once there was a man who was afraid to die, and so he became a king of long shadows. He fed on fear and called it necessity. He called his curse a crown. But in the end, when his loneliness grew heavier than his power, a bell rang and a girl came. She reminded him that the choice that damned him need not be his last." Mira's eyes shone. "And what did he choose?" she whispered. He smiled then, not with fangs or malice, but with a quiet, almost shy tenderness. It made him look briefly like the young man in the tattered memory, before war and dark bargains. "He chose," the vampire king said, "to stop being king." He closed his eyes. The air in the throne room thickened, not with menace, but with a kind of held breath. Mira felt it pressing against her skin, filling her lungs, ringing in her ears. The painted stars on the ceiling seemed to tremble. The shadows gathered around the vampire king, wrapping him in a deepening cloak of night that did not swallow light so much as absorb sorrow. For the first time since he had taken on the curse, he did not resist its pull. He did not channel it into claws and teeth, into terror and domination. Instead, he gathered it inward. Every time he had fed, every fear he had ever inspired, every whispered prayer against his name, he let them all surface, not to torment him, but to be held. "I am sorry," he said, not to Mira, not even to any god who might be listening, but to the world itself. His voice shook, ancient and young at once. "I am sorry for the hurt my fear has made. I am sorry I believed my life was worth more than all the lives that ended beneath my shadow. Take back what I stole. Take back my place in your stories. Let there be no more kings like me." The darkness inside him, which had always swelled at words of power, hesitated. These words were of a different kind. They were not a spell. They were a surrender. He opened his arms, as if to embrace the very curse that filled him. "I give myself," he whispered, "not to more night, to release, to the quiet that heals." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Mira saw it. A faint light, very small, flickering in his chest, as if a star had been trapped there all these years and was only now remembering how to burn. The shadows around him recoiled, confused. Light was not part of their understanding of power. The vampire king did not inhale. The dead do not breathe. But if he had, it would have been the greatest breath of his existence. He drew all those shadows in, every tendril of curse and hunger, tightening them around that small, stubborn light. "This is my choice," he said, and now his voice rang not only in the room but in some unseen place where old magic listened. "Not for myself. For you, world I feared. For you, lives I have touched. Let this be enough to break what I have been." The light in his chest flared. It did not explode. It did not burn. It unfolded gently like a flower opening in slow motion. The shadows, having nowhere else to go, sank into it, into the one thing they had never understood, a will willing to lay itself down. Mira shielded her eyes, but even with her lids closed, she felt a warmth pass through her, mild and clean, leaving no pain behind. It flowed outward from the vampire king, through the walls of the castle, down the mountain, over the sleeping village, across fields and rivers and forgotten graves. Where it passed, burdens eased by a hair's breadth. Old fears loosened their grip. Lantern flames flickered as if in greeting. Then the light dimmed, not fading into nothing, but settling. When Mira opened her eyes, the throne room was no longer heavy with dread. It was simply a room. Old stone, empty corridors, painted stars that suddenly seemed like memories rather than omens. Before her stood a man. Not a king, not a monster. He He was still pale, but with the pallor of one who has been long indoors, not the bloodless sheen of undeath. His hair was threaded with gray at the temples. His eyes, no longer black wells, were a deep, soft brown, like earth at dusk. He staggered, catching himself on the air as if surprised that it held him. He looked down at his own hands, flexing the fingers as if testing them for the first time. He laughed then, a small, astonished sound. I am tired. The word did not echo this time. It settled warmly. Mira's heart leaped. She stepped forward, reaching out. Are you? Alive, he finished for her, meeting her gaze. There were tears in his eyes. They did not fall, but they shone. I think yes, but not as before, not as something that stretches without end. I feel lines, limits. He closed his eyes briefly, savoring the unfamiliarity. I feel an ending someday, a real one. He looked at her, gratitude unfolding across his features like dawn. You were right, he said hoarsely. The first choice was not the last. The curse wanted me to believe that. It needed me to cling to myself. Letting go was the one thing it could not command. What happened to it? Mira asked, glancing around, half expecting some new darkness to be waiting in the corners. He shook his head. It has no hold without a willing heart to wrap around. I drew it all into the only thing that was truly mine to give, my will to be. And then I let that go. He smiled faintly. What remains is just me, whatever that means now. Mira exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her legs trembled, the enormity of what had just taken place settling into her bones. She was suddenly very aware of how far from home she was, how narrow the path down would be in the dimming night. As if reading her thoughts, the man, no longer king, no longer monster, held out his arm. May I walk you back? He asked. There was shyness in the question and a quiet hope. She took his arm. Together, they left the throne room. The castle no longer loomed around them. It felt like an old shell, outgrown, waiting to crumble gently back into the mountain that had lent its stone. As they descended the stairs, dust motes spun lazily in the air, golden in what little light filtered through the high windows. From somewhere far away came the faint creak of wood settling, as if the building itself were sighing in relief. They stepped out into the night. The mountain air was cold, but no longer sharp with the taste of distant fear. The sky overhead was vast and clear, thick with stars. The man lifted his face to it, eyes closing as the wind brushed his skin. How long has it been, he murmured, since the night felt like this? Not an enemy, not a kingdom, just a sky. They took the path down slowly. Mira guided him around the loose stones, showing him where to place his feet. Once he slipped, unused to a body that could misstep. They both laughed, the sound echoing softly against the rocks. Halfway down, he paused and looked back. The castle, perched on its high ledge, seemed smaller now. Its spires were less like fangs and more like the broken teeth of an old comb. In time, the wind and rain would wear it away. He felt no urge to stop that. Some things were meant to become ruins, and then stories, and then nothing. What will they say, he wondered aloud, when they learn their monster is gone? Mira followed his gaze. Some will be glad, she said. Some will be afraid because fear is a habit. Some will not believe it. Stories grow comfortable even when they are frightening. And you, he asked, what will you say? She considered. I will say, she decided, that once there was a king who was very powerful and very lonely. Everyone thought his greatest enemy was the world that feared him. But in the end, he learned that the enemy had always been the fear inside him, that small, frightened part that would not let him be just a man among others. When he finally chose to lay down that fear, he saved more than he had ever destroyed. He listened, his eyes bright in the starlight. That is a kind story, he said softly. It is a true one, she replied. They continued on. By the time they reached the edge of the forest that bordered the village, the eastern sky was beginning to pale. The first hint of dawn painted the horizon in muted rose. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the man felt the approach of sunlight not as a threat, but as a gentle, inevitable tide. "It will be strange," he said, smiling faintly, "to sleep at night and wake in the day." Mira laughed. "You will grow used to it, and to other things. Bread fresh from the oven, children running in the road, work that leaves your muscles sore and your heart content." He looked at her. "If they do not accept me." "They may not at first," she admitted. "But you are not the only one who can change. Their fear is also an old habit. It too can be laid down." He nodded slowly. "Perhaps that is their sacrifice to make, as mine was to let go of myself." They stood for a moment at the forest's edge, listening to the quiet stir of birds waking, to the distant murmur of the village. Mira turned to him. "Do you remember your name?" He searched his memory, as one might rummage through a chest of old clothes, lifting one garment after another, holding it to the light. So many titles, so many whispered epithets, but beneath them, faint as a seed's first sprout, he found it. "I think," he said, tasting it, "I was once called Lior." "Lior," she repeated, and the name seemed to settle around him comfortably, like a cloak of simple wool after years of wearing only armor. He smiled. "Come, Lior," she said. "Let us show them that the story on the mountain has changed." And so they walked together into the soft light of morning. A girl whose courage had answered a lonely bell, and a man who had once been a king of shadows but had chosen, at last, to be simply human. In time, the villagers' stories shifted. They still spoke of the vampire king, for old tales do not disappear overnight. But now, when they pointed to the mountain at dusk, there was less fear in their voices and more wonder. They spoke, too, of a different legend. Of the night the bell rang once, and someone answered. Of the king who discovered that his greatest enemy was not the world that feared him, but the fear that had taught him to stand apart from it. And of how, in laying that fear down, he gave the world back to itself and returned, not as a ruler, but as a neighbor. Children grew up hearing that story. Some climbed the mountain paths, not to challenge a monster, but to sit among the old stones and feel the quiet there, learning that even the darkest places can remember how to rest. And if, on especially clear nights, when the bells in the village rang for weddings or harvests or simple joy, a faint answering note seemed to echo from somewhere in the high, wind-worn ruins, no one was afraid. They only smiled and listened, and let the sound fold gently into the music of their lives.